it seems like half the year. I can't believe how fast the year goes by. I mean, it's already March, and we're still just scratching the surface of Exodus. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is consider you were warned.
Hey, y'all voted for it, so you knew what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What can you do?
There's no
Well, we are. Go
apologies.
ahead.
No, I was just saying there's no apologies for it.
Yeah, I guess that's a good way to look at it. We are indeed going into Exodus 4 today. We're going to do the first 17 verses. I'm going to leave the famous or infamous Bridegroom of Blood passage for next time. So let's just start by reading the 17 verses here that we'll get into, and we'll do what we usually do, just go through and make some comments on some things that are interesting. So then Moses answered, but behold, again, he's still arguing with God. Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, then they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. I love that line. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. Now that is Exodus 4, 1 through 17. Again, there's some interesting things lurking around in here. This is actually Moses' third objection to God's call. The previous two were in Exodus 3 and verse 11. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of, I'm a nobody. And then Exodus 3:13, if I come to the people of Israel and say, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say? I mean, he's making excuses. And now God again delivers the divine name, which had something to do with presence. God was promising to be with them. I have the power to do something new here. And we get into chapter 4, and here he is again. I mean, Moses has not broken stride. Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. They will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Again, he's treading water here, and he's making excuses. And God responds by giving Moses 3 signs to perform to validate Yahweh is with him. Verses 2 through 5, we get the rod and the snakes. Verses 6 and 7, we get the skin diseased arm and its healing. And then, of course, following that, we get the water to blood. Asarna, here in his commentary, has something interesting to say that kind of gets us, kicks us off here. He says Moses is instructed how to dissipate popular skepticism should it materialize. Deuteronomy 13, 2 through 6 discusses the role of the sign in the legitimation of a prophet in Israel. Here, the signs which will be executed in Egypt possess a distinctly Egyptian coloration. This is not surprising, for magic was a pervasive ingredient of everyday life in Egypt. deeply embedded in the culture. The signs taught to Moses are intended, first and foremost, to validate his claim to be the divinely chosen instrument for the redemption of Israel. On a secondary level, they also function to establish the superiority of Moses over the Egyptian magicians, and by extension, to affirm the superior might of Israel's God over those whom the Egyptians worshipped as gods. Moses, however, is not a magician. He possesses no superhuman powers and no esoteric knowledge. He is unable to initiate or perform anything except by precise instructions from God. He pronounces no spells, he observes no rituals, and employs no occult techniques. And often he does not know in advance the consequences of the actions he is told to perform. That's the end of Sarna. And the last paragraph I think is really interesting because when you read the stories, it's true. Moses never does any ritual. He never utters an incantation, no abracadabra, kind of stuff. He never casts a spell. And he has none of the techniques that Egyptian magicians and the Egyptians generally would have expected. He just says, look, I listened to my God. This is what my God said. Now let's just all watch. Because again, Sarna is correct. Again, as you read the story, there are a number of situations where Moses would not really quite have known what to expect, what the fallout would be. And he sort of finds out with everybody else. And that would have spoken something, to an Egyptian, because the Egyptians are expecting, you're a magician, right? You do what magicians. No, actually, I'm not a magician. I'm just a servant of the Most High God. So you need to let us go. Again, there are differences there that are important. So let's talk about the first set, the serpents and the staff. The Lord says to him, "What's in your hand?" He said, "A staff. Throw it on the ground." He throws it on the ground, it becomes a serpent. And again, we know the rest of it. Moses gets scared, and God says, hey, take it by the tail, and it becomes a staff in his hand. Now, the English translation here, and if you compare the translation here to Exodus 7, 9, and 10, when Moses and Aaron actually do this, right now it's sort of God's just telling them what to do, but when you get into Exodus 7, they actually do this. The English translation sort of obscures an interesting item that some would call a problem. Okay, I'm going to read you the way the ESV has in Exodus 7, 9 through 10, just to make the point that this isn't really very detectable in English. When Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, and he did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. You say, well, what's the difference? I'm going to read you a selection from John Currid's book. That's Currid. Currid is trained as an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago. He teaches, I can't remember where, he teaches at one of the Reformed seminaries, I think in the Midwest. Don't quote me there, but it is one of the Reformed seminaries. But he has a book called Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. It's a 1997 title. And he writes this. I'm going to give you some sections of pages 86 through 92. So Currid writes, when Aaron was ordered by Moses to throw down his staff before Pharaoh, okay, and he's commenting specifically on Exodus 7, 9 through 10 here in this section. When Aaron was ordered to do this, it was transformed into a tanin, is the Hebrew word, tanin. One would have expected it to change into a nachash, because the first sign given to Moses in Exodus 4, 2-3, that he was to perform in Egypt was the turning of the staff into a nachash. Why is a different Hebrew term used in the two accounts? Let me just stop there. So back in Exodus 4, which is where we are, the Hebrew term for what the staff becomes, this snake, is nachash. But in Exodus 7, it's tanin, which elsewhere gets translated something like dragon. Okay? So Currid points this out, which you can't really see in English. And he says, well, why, what's the deal with the two different words? He continues now. Many scholars argue that the alteration of terminology is due to the change in scene. They argue that tanin is a crocodile, because that word can mean dragon. They argue that tanin is a crocodile rather than a serpent, and thus more accurately reflects the Egyptian environment. Umberto Cassuto, famous Jewish commentator, comments, quote, instead of the serpent most appropriate to the desert, in which form the sign was transmitted to Moses, comes here the dragon or crocodile most appropriate to the Egyptian milieu, unquote. Currid says, supporting that position is the fact that the biblical authors often use the word tanin of large reptiles that were more formidable than the simple nakash, and he cites a few passages. Other scholars argue that the variation in terms is just a matter of poetic license. Now, Currid, here's where he's at. He says, it is doubtful that the Exodus writer meant anything more than that the rods of Aaron and the magicians turned into large snakes. So he says it's not a crocodile, it's snakes. In the first place, tanin and nakash appear to be used interchangeably in the early chapters of Exodus. Thus, shortly after the serpent contest, God commands Moses, quote, go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a nakash, into a serpent. And I'll just stop there. In other words, the tanin word is not used there right at the Nile, which you would think if it's a crocodile, that's the word they would use. But he's referring back to the incident in chapter 7 where tanin was used. But here, later on in verse 15, Exodus 7:15, same chapter, a few verses later, what was in front of Pharaoh, what Pharaoh and his magicians are confronted with was not a tanin, it was a nakash. So the terms get interchanged. Back to Currid. He says, clearly the writer is referring here to the immediately preceding story where the term tanin is employed. The Septuagint is of little help in this matter, although it translates tanin into the Greek drakon, dragon, large reptile. It also applies drakon to numerous instances of nakash, Job 26:13, Isaiah 27:1, Amos 9:3. If anything, the Septuagint supports the idea of the two Hebrew words often being used synonymously. That's the end of Currid. Now, I just introduced that because I thought it was interesting, and you may, again, it's the kind of thing that you're going to find on a website, contradictions in the Bible. Well, could we actually spend a little bit of time, looking to see if the terms are interchanged elsewhere and it really doesn't matter? Might be a good idea. So I wanted to introduce it here because of the novelty of it, so that you would know, people have noticed this and scholars have written about it, but the two terms in Exodus do just really appear to be interchangeable. And in the mind of the translator of the Septuagint, the same thing is true. So we're probably just dealing with snakes here and not crocodiles. Verse 5, again, I want to draw your attention just to a word here. We have a repetition of what we saw in the previous week's episode in chapter 3 about God appearing, using that appeared language. We get it again in verse 5. Okay, God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Again, same language that we talked about last time with the burning bush, and it's just reinforced here. Verse 6, then again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak, and then we get him taking his hand out, and the ESV has his hand was leprous like snow. Now we covered this in our series on Leviticus. This term used in Hebrew is not actually leprosy. Okay, if you actually, you could go back to the episodes in Leviticus where we talked about this. The term used there and the description, more importantly, that is given in the book of Exodus is not consistent with what we know as leprosy today. So Sarna writes here, the Hebrew tzara'at, usually mistranslated leprosy, has none of the major symptoms of that malady. And the descriptions of tzara'at given in Leviticus 13 and 14 are incompatible with Hansen's disease, which is what we know today as leprosy. Sarna continues, the comparison to snow is not in respect of its whiteness, but of its flakiness. Apart from the startling phenomenon of the sudden appearance and the disappearance of the encrustation, this particular sign has an ominous aspect to it in that it is seen in the Bible as a divine punishment for human misbehavior. That's the end of the Sarna quote. So I just wanted to park on that a little bit and hearken back again to our earlier episodes of Leviticus, just when it comes to that particular issue. Verses 8 and 9, if they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So this sign, the Nile turning into blood, turns out to be used for the first plague, as the actual story unfolds. It seems significant that at the continued resistance to, the signs that Moses is giving, Moses runs out of signs. He's got his staff there, with the changing it into a serpent. He can stick his hand in his cloak. But if Pharaoh doesn't believe those two, he's kind of out of ammunition as far as objects or parts of himself that can demonstrate anything. So at this point, essentially, with the third sign here, the water turning into blood, God has to take over. And I think that might be the point. Pharaoh's resistance to a sign where clearly Moses isn't doing he's not manipulating an object. He's not doing sleight of hand magic. The hand in the cloak, out of the cloak, back in again. Oh, look at that. Again, he's not doing any of that stuff after the second sign. The third sign is literally an act of God. And again, this isn't new to me. It's lots of commentators have pointed this out. It seems like Pharaoh's resistance sort of brings God forward center stage and says, okay, here we go. We're going to watch. I'm going to turn the water of the Nile, which was like super significant because that's the lifeblood of Egypt, pun intended. I'm going to turn it to blood. It's going to pollute the land. This is an act of God. And so this actually launches the series of what will become known as the 10 plagues. It's a transition point. Pharaoh's resistance to what Moses is doing turns out to be like the last straw. And then God says, okay, I'm going to take over from here. And the confrontation, when God enters the picture, as it were, when it's an undeniable act of God, the confrontation therefore shifts to not Moses versus Pharaoh or Moses versus Pharaoh's magicians. Now it's God versus Pharaoh, who is the living Horus in Egyptian thinking. Pharaoh was considered the incarnation of a deity. In Egyptian theology, the Pharaoh was thought to be the living incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra. And as soon as the Pharaoh dies, his son, the next in line, becomes the new Horus. This was the thinking. The first name of Pharaoh's fivefold titulary. In Egypt, the Pharaoh had 5 names, and they represented different things, different aspects of either his rule or his nature or something. He had a 5-fold name, 5-fold titulary. And the first of those was his Horus name. Now, Hoffmeyer has a Bible review article on Son of God language in the Old Testament, how that compares, how that maps over to Egyptian thinking. And Hoffmeyer teaches at Wheaton. He's an Egyptologist by training. He points out in his article, quote, during the Old Kingdom, which is 2700 to 2200 BC, the epithet, one of the epithets, attributed to Pharaoh was the Necher-Aa, the great god. This epithet was applied to the king, only to be replaced by the less exalted Necher-Nefer, the good god, in subsequent periods. Additionally, the pharaoh could be called the image, Tut, it's T-W-T in Egyptian, the Tut, the image of a deity. For example, Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, literally means the living image of Amun. It's the end of Hoffmeyer. So the evidence is very clear that the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the incarnation of Horus, of a deity, and they would refer to the pharaoh as the great god. So when God says, "Okay, I'll take over from here," and starts pounding Pharaoh and pounding the nation, that speaks volumes. And again, Pharaoh's heart is going to harden. He's not surrendering the title, okay, anytime soon. He knows what's at stake in terms of his own reputation. Pharaoh is supposed to be the regulator of the divine order. And the divine order says that the Nile floods at the same time every year and gives the land life-giving soil on either side of the Nile, the black land. That's what Egypt called itself, the black land, the Kemet, okay? the black land where things grow. This is miles, of arable land out there in the middle of the desert. The gods keep Egypt alive. This is why Egypt is great, because of the Nile. And God says, pardon me, I'm going to turn that to blood for a while. We'll see how that goes. So again, it's a shift in the confrontation and how it would have been read and parsed by Egyptians in light of their own theology. And we go down to verse 10, again, yet another objection of Moses, again, before the showdown actually happens. His fourth objection, Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent. Either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant," which I take as a generic reference to his servants. Or, again, you could say there's a little bit of space here between this conversation and the burning bush. Could be, but it could be generic as well. He said, I can't talk well. I'm slow of speech and of tongue. And it is true that you can look at those Hebrew terms there, and it could be that Moses was a stutterer. I mean, that's certainly possible. It's not terribly important, because even if he's not, he's making another excuse. I can't do it. Just can't do it. And of course, God says, well, who makes a man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Isn't it I? Get off your butt and go. I'll be with your mouth. I'll teach you what you should speak. But again, Moses isn't having any of it. So this is the fourth objection. And God has been patient, to say the least, up to this point. He has answered Moses' objections with, I'll give you signs. You do this. I'll step in, with the water turned to blood. Once you get into Egypt, I'll help you with what you say. I mean, I'm present. You're going back to our discussion of the name. And Moses just is resistant. So by the time you get to verse 14, 13 and 14, God is angry. But Moses said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." Now he doesn't even bother making an excuse. He says, "I don't want to go." It's pretty simple. Pretty simple. You've handled my objections and my excuses. Let's just get down to it. I don't want to go. I'm either scared or I got some other, I don't want to go. Please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. He still doesn't just fry Moses on the spot, which you almost see like that would be the outcome. And he says, look, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. He doesn't have your problem. He doesn't stutter, okay? Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. So God, again, has already anticipated this. God has already tapped Aaron on the shoulder, get out to the desert. Moses is out there. You need to go see him. You shall speak to him, God says. You shall speak to Aaron and put the words in his mouth. You tell Aaron what to say. I'll tell you what to say. You tell Aaron what to say. I'll be with you both. Like I am giving you the words, you're going to give him the words. You'll be to him like I am to you. That's why God says you will be, as Elohim, to him. You're going to play my role. The role I'm playing in relationship to you, you're going to play in relationship to Aaron. This is how we'll work it. He's on his way. Now, this is going to become significant later on when we get to, in the next episode, the bridegroom of blood, because Moses apparently just takes off. He doesn't even wait for Aaron. They never have the conversation, and God gets real angry. He's about to kill Moses. And that's not the only reason as well that God is really, really angry with him. We'll see that next time. But this is part of it. He doesn't even wait. I mean, he really doesn't want to go. It's pretty evident. Now, what I want to focus on here, though, for this episode is it is at this point that we have to go back and revisit something that we talked about in our earlier Hebrews series. This is when you get Aaron enter the picture. And once Aaron is in the picture, this is the beginning point of Aaron's role as intercessor for Moses to compensate for Moses' weakness. And, honestly, I think there's a bit of a punishment in here as well. Aaron is going to be part of the picture now, and he's going to have an intercessory role in the place of Moses between for Pharaoh, and also between the people in some instances, and specifically things like the Day of Atonement, ritual, where only Aaron, only the high priest was allowed to go in, to the Holy of Holies. Moses didn't get to do that. It's at this point where that starts. Aaron becomes part of the picture, and it is a concession to Moses' unbelief, his resistance. And we talked about this in our series in the book of Hebrews, because back then we spent a lot of time talking about Melchizedek. You shall be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, this language about Jesus. And we asked the question back in our Hebrews episodes, well, what in the world is going on here? I thought Israel had a high priesthood. It was Aaron. Why does the writer of Hebrews go back to Melchizedek, of course, who was the time of Abraham, predates Aaron? And we spent a lot of time talking about Melchizedek and his priesthood. And part of our discussion was the notion, again, in scholarship, again, this isn't unique to Mike. Mike's not making this up. You'll see this discussion in a number of places, where the whole presence, the whole piece in Israelite thinking, in Israel as a nation, in the worship of Israel, the whole element of the Aaronic priesthood arose out of this conversation. In other words, it was not God's original intention. It was a concession to Moses. It was God being kind. God could have very well said, okay, we're done here, fried, or just go home. You're done. I'll go get somebody else. He doesn't do that. He gives Moses an out. Okay, there's a concession here. He's merciful. But this is where the Aaronic priesthood starts. It was not part of God's original plan. And we talked again about how that fits in with kingship and Melchizedek, who's the king of Salem, Salem, Jerusalem, how that became the model for the Messiah. You can go back to episode 167 and listen to that. I'm just going to, sort of, pick out a few summary statements here, again, from that material. But this is it's an issue for biblical theology. It helps to understand the Aaronic priesthood as being a concession. It helps to parse what's going on with Melchizedek, and just generally what the template was supposed to be, and why in the perfect servant, the one who doesn't make excuses, the Messiah, Jesus, why both of these things, the kingship, the leadership, the rulership, the political leadership of the nation, is blended with the priestly relationship, why it's blended into one person. That was the typical pattern. That was the intended pattern. Because up until this point, and again, this is just a general comment, and I'll get into a few more specifics here. But up until this point, God is working through single individuals, not pairs. Okay, he's not doing Batman and Robin. There is no Robin. He's not working with his people as a group through pairs, through teams or duos. There's single leadership. This is the point of transition. And this is a departure from the heretofore normal template of doing things. So the original kingship of Jerusalem, think about it a little more broadly here, and I'll draw some material in from our earlier episode 167 when we were talking about Melchizedek. The original kingship of Jerusalem didn't go back to David. It goes back to Melchizedek. Again, Melchizedek was the model. He was the king of Salem. Jerusalem, get it? Okay, there's this connection here. He was the prototype. The original kingship of Jerusalem also entailed a priestly role. Melchizedek was also a priest of the Most High God. The priestly role would not be inherited by the sons of Aaron when it came to the Messiah. Okay, it would be inherited by the descendants of Abraham. It has chronological priority over the Aaronic priesthood. Again, the whole Melchizedek thing has chronological priority. So the Aaronic priesthood, when that comes into view, it splits the role. It gives Israel two leaders instead of one. The political leader was Moses, the priestly leader was Aaron. The argument that Aaron's priesthood, again, was supposed to be like the original design just doesn't work. There's a good argument, again, and I think Exodus 4 makes it pretty clear. There's a good argument to be made that Aaron's priesthood was a concession to the lack of faith on Moses' part. It was plan B. And plan A would have been to have Moses be both the political leader and the priestly leader, to intercede before the people, for the people with respect to God. But that isn't how it emerges. The role splits because of this. Now you can say, well, Moses, he still interceded for the people, with God, and think about the wilderness wanderings and all. Yeah, he does that. He does that stuff. But when they get in the land, and the land is going to be the place where they build a temple, God's going to come and be their God. They will be his people. When they get into the land, that ain't the case. It's split in two. It's two separate offices instead of one. So it's at this point in Exodus 4 that Aaron's status is elevated to essentially co-leader. And that'll be his status. It'll lead to him becoming the high priest. Again, this is just how it works. Now think about what happens after this scene in the Exodus story. Moses apparently, again, if we look at Exodus 4, 24 through 27, he apparently leaves for Egypt without Aaron. Now, in this incident, the bridegroom of blood incident with Zipporah, where God is going to kill Moses, which we'll talk about next time, Moses apparently left for Egypt without Aaron. I mean, God had told him, look, your brother Aaron's on the way, you talk to him, here's how it's going to be. Moses, he's out of Dodge. Well, again, that might indicate Moses is just a screw up. It probably indicates just plain old disobedience. He leaves Aaron behind after all of this wrangling with God and after God's anger and his compassionate concession and just, all of that right after he says, can you send somebody else? God gets angry and says, look, here's what we'll do. We'll bring Aaron into the picture. After hearing that, Moses just takes off without him, without ever telling Aaron that he was part of God's plan. Now, again, we'll cover that scene, the bridegroom of blood scene, next time. But after you get past that, Aaron, think about what Aaron does. Aaron repeats the signs that God originally told Moses to perform. So not only can you get, well, Moses does priestly things, he meets with God and he intercedes with God. Don't blot them out, God. Yeah, right. But Aaron actually also does Moses things as well. I mean, they're co-leaders now, when the original plan was to have one. So Aaron repeats signs that God originally told Moses to perform. An example is Exodus 4, 29 through 30. We read this. We're still in chapter 4 here, but we're past the bridegroom of blood thing. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs. Aaron did the signs in the sight of the people. And of course, the outcome is positive. The elders believe, just like God said they would, despite Moses' unbelief. Aaron acts in the place of Moses at other times. In Exodus 4 and 5 and 6, you see this going on. In Exodus 6:12, for instance, Moses again does not believe the people will listen to him if he speaks God's words with them. I'll just read you the verse. But Moses said to the Lord, behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised. He's complaining that, look, I can't talk. I told you, God, I can't talk. They're not going to listen. So Aaron is brought on the scene in verse 13 in Exodus 6 to get the job done. And he does. In the rest of Exodus 6, we get you're reading along in Exodus 6, Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, and they're duking it out, and, all this kind of stuff. And then right in the middle of that, you get what? You get a genealogy. Again, we'll hit this when we get to chapter 6, but we get the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. And then the text adds what feels like an explanation for why the genealogies are even there. Okay, here's verse 26 with the comment on the genealogy. So you got Moses and Aaron. Aaron's the co-leader. He's doing what Moses won't do. And then you get a genealogy right in the middle of that, just thrown in there. And then you hit verse 26 right after the genealogy. This is what it says. These are the Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring out the people of Israel from the land of Egypt by their hosts. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron. Notice the plural language. These are the Aaron and the Moses to whom the Lord said to both of them, he spoke to both of them, bring out the people of Israel from the land. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron. On the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you. But Moses said to the Lord, behold, I'm of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me? Yeah, the writer actually brings verse 12 back at the end of the genealogy and explains why it's there. It's because on the day that the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt and said, you tell Pharaoh, I'm the Lord. Moses said, look, I can't talk well. Again, an editorial hand here, has actually put verse 12 right back here, right after the genealogy, to tell you why it's there, to tell you why there were co-leaders. And if you look at the situation, Moses saying, I can't talk, that is what prompted, that's part of the transition to include Aaron way back at the burning bush in chapter 4. So the writer or the editor is telling you, this is why we got two. This is why we have two and not one. So basically saying, this is why, there you go. Aaron's here because Moses chickened out, or he was just a rebel. He just was disobedient. He was faithless. And again, you take that against the context of the wider flow of biblical history. The leadership, again, up to this point had been one individual, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You could almost count Joseph, but we'll just stick with, the major patriarchs here. So you got at least three. You can throw Joseph in there if you want. Then you hit Moses. They're single leaders, single mediators. There's no duo. There's no duet. There's no team. Okay, here with Moses, it splits. Aaron's priesthood is a result of Moses' unbelief from the very beginning. It's a concession. Incidentally, this makes the golden calf incident all the more tragic. Again, we'll get to that in the future too, because it's Aaron's fault. Aaron screws up there. Moses gets better, but by then, again, the Aaronic priesthood is in place. So, this whole situation, this whole episode, these first 17 verses, and again, picking up toward the end of chapter 4 as well, and we'll save the bridegroom of blood for next week. It's kind of important. And again, I think it's important because of the role it will play, the role it does play, and the role it will play later. Like if you get into the New Testament with Melchizedek and all that stuff, it creates a context for why Jesus, again, refuses the two leadership roles back into one. Now, there are kings like David. Again, you can go back and listen to episode 167. David does some priestly things. There are hints of this. Again, and it's important that it's David. It's important that it's Solomon, because these are the archetypal figures, especially David. And it's his line. It's his dynastic line. This is the line from which or through which God will produce the ultimate son of David, the Messiah. And when we get that in the New Testament, the two things are brought back together. We get back to God's original ideal of one person who is both the political, military, deliverer and the mediator between God and men. So this helps us understand why there was two in so many other contexts, why it goes to one, because it was originally one, and this is a concession. So I think that's important. The other thing I think, again, that we can get out of this is the tolerance of God. I mean, even though he gets so angry, with Moses, and he's going to get angry with Moses on other occasions too. He doesn't allow Moses' obstinacy to thwart what he wants Moses to do. Now, that's not the case with everybody. Sometimes God just does say goodbye. So long, that kind of thing, and he moves to another. He does that with the kings, of Israel, the monarchy, the whole bit. He doesn't do it here, which again I think is significant. But it's really interesting, and we'll end with this. What's really interesting is when you actually read through the story, you get Aaron not only speaking for Moses, but actually doing things that Moses was supposed to do. And you get this weird, let's throw in a genealogy here so that our later readers know who we're talking about. It was these two guys. These two guys are who you think they are. It was the same Moses and Aaron that did, and the reason why we had two is because Moses just quit. He chickened out. He didn't want to do it. And so God had to bring Aaron back into the picture. Yeah, I think there are wider implications here as well for, people who are sort of hung up on maybe priestly stuff as being, somehow we need to connect, priestly stuff to Jesus so that we do Jesus or worship Jesus right, or that we're disciples like Jesus. We're in Exodus 4:18 through 31, and the whole thing isn't about the bridegroom of blood incident. That's really only 3 verses in this section, verses 24 through 26. And we've already, based on the last episode, we drifted over into this second half of chapter 4, so we've already touched on a few things in this section of verses 18 through 31, but our focus is going to be those specific verses, 24, 25, 26 today. But just, again, so that we're familiar with where we're at, I'm going to read the whole thing, the whole section. So starting in verse 18, we read, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him. Now, this is right after the burning bush story, or at least ostensibly. So Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Verse 24, these next few verses are going to be our focus. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. Back to verse 27. Then the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. That's the end of the section and the end of the chapter. Now you can already tell that this is kind of a chronological mess. You get the burning bush incident, and on the tail end of that, when Moses is basically saying, please find someone else to do this, and God gets angry at him, like we talked about last time. We've had a series of objections, and then Moses, if God gives him answers to all the objections, then Moses just flatly said, I don't want to go. God gets angry, and then God makes a concession to Moses, and we talked about the concession last time. This is where we get the Aaronic priesthood sort of launched. God brings Aaron into the picture as a concession to Moses, and God actually says, back in verse 14, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Well, between that statement of, hey, Aaron's on his way, he's coming out to meet you, we get Moses going back to Jethro, to ask him about going. Why didn't he wait for Aaron? We talked about this last time. And then you get God speaking again to Moses in Midian, at apparently Jethro's place, because it follows his return to Jethro, where Jethro lives. And then you got all that going on. Then Moses takes off, and then we get the bridegroom of blood incident where God wants to kill Moses, apparently. And then after that, then we're back to Aaron. Then God says in verse 27, Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness and meet Moses. Well, I thought he already told Aaron to do that. and then they actually meet up, and then they wind up and eat. So chronologically, this is just a mess. And that's part of the problem. And, even if we took out verses 24 through 26, did we just, cut them out? We did a Thomas Jefferson or something. You still have a chronological problem because, hey, I thought back in verse 14, God had already tapped Aaron on the shoulder. And here in verse 27, he's doing it again. Well, what in the world's going on here? So we've got a chronological problem, to say the least. We've got the intrusion of this really bizarre episode, the Bridegroom of Blood. And so the issue is, what in the world, do we do with this stuff? Now, I would suggest, again, there are, broadly speaking, two ways to read verses 18 through 31. And I alluded to the first of these in the last episode. Honestly, you got to use your imagination here, and sort of admit that you have to infer things, or things might be implied rather than stated. Okay, but let's just jump into it, because either way, there's a lot to deal with here. So there's two ways to sort of read this section. First one is, you could say, well, it's implied in the previous section, okay, the burning bush incident, the tail end of that Aaron is literally on his way, having been tapped or prompted by God to meet his brother Moses. That little phrase, he is coming out to meet you, again in verse 14. But we never read, of course, that they actually meet. Again, when we talked about this the last episode. Instead, we get the distinct impression from verses 18 and following that Moses just left after God makes the concession, hey, we'll bring Aaron into the picture here to help you out. Moses just takes off, regardless of the fact that God said, hey, he's on his way. He's coming out to meet you. Well, apparently they never meet. Moses leaves. He goes back to Jethro's place. Now, we know that Jethro's place, where he lived, was not at the mountain of God because of Exodus 3:1, which we spent, 4 weeks on? Okay, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So Jethro doesn't live at the mountain. It's not like the movie The Ten Commandments where, the mountain's a few hundred yards away or something. Okay, that's not the impression you get. So Moses goes back to Jethro's place. But then in verse 27, we see that Aaron meets Moses at the mountain of God. Apparently, again, we're just suggesting one way to look at this. Apparently, Moses went back to Sinai after returning to Jethro. But that raises two questions. Was it okay for Moses to leave Sinai at the end of the burning bush episode and go back to Jethro and then return to Sinai? We aren't told. We aren't told if God was good with that or not. But we could presume that it was okay because Aaron, for all we know, is back in Egypt. I mean, he's still back in Egypt. It would take a while for Aaron to get to Sinai. The second question it raises is, did God anticipate Moses' rebellion and call Aaron earlier? So Aaron is basically right around the corner, ready to meet Moses, and then Moses takes off. We aren't told that either. And again, I'll just throw in a third question here. Did Moses return to Sinai with his tail between his legs in fear? Like he leaves when he's not supposed to. Then he talks to Jethro, and God taps him on that. God meets him again. God speaks to him again. Okay. And then Moses, okay, I got to go back to Sinai. I'm in trouble. Does he go back fearfully? Is that how we're supposed to read this? If so, was the threat of verses 24 through 26 when God's ready to kill him, is that directly related to Moses leaving, or is that related to something else? So we've got a number of questions here before we even get to the bizarre 3 verses that we're going to focus on, because we have a non-chronological thing going on in Exodus 4 that's really related again to the burning bush episode. Stuff that happens earlier, earlier in chapter 3 and chapter 4, but mostly chapter 4, because that's where you get the conversation between God and Moses, where Moses just basically says, I don't want to go, and then God makes the concession with Aaron. Now, there's another way to read this, okay? Here's the second way to sort of approach it. The other way to read this is that verses 24 through 26 are simply an intrusion. They're a literary intrusion. They have nothing to do with the chronology. It's placed there because the author isn't concerned with the chronology of things, but with telegraphing some other point. Yeah, that's possible. We're going to encounter other places in Exodus that are clearly not chronological, even though they, we tend to think that as we're reading through a book, everything that's happening is chronological. But there are going to be some places where it's absolutely clear. For instance, we're gonna hit one place where they put Aaron's rod before the testimony, and the testimony is a term that's related to the Ark of the Covenant. But that's in a chapter before the Ark of the Covenant's even created. It's not even made yet. So it's very obviously not chronological. So we're going to hit stuff like that in Exodus. So this is a possibility that verses 24 to 26 are just sort of dropped in there for some other reason other than the chronology. And in so doing, it kind of messes up the chronology for us. But let's be honest, even without those verses, there's stuff that messes up the chronology. Now, if this is the case, that verses 24 through 26 are just sort of dropped in there, that would mean that the meeting of verses 27 through 31 could actually follow verse 17. In other words, God sent Aaron to meet Moses at Sinai, suggesting Moses stayed there a while before going back to Jethro's place. We can imagine that happening. We can imagine verses 27 through 31 happening at Sinai before Moses goes back to Jethro in verse 18. If the sections of the chapter are loosed from being a strict chronology, then we can move them around. We can play with them a little bit. Again, that might be a way to approach this. But that creates a problem too. If this is the case, when does Moses actually meet Jethro to ask for permission, verse 18, to go to Egypt as the Lord commanded? And why would God have to speak to Moses again in Midian, reiterating the conversation about going to Egypt that had taken place at Sinai? In other words, if we move the meeting with Aaron, verses 27 to 31, up to happen right after the burning bush, then that should have been a settled matter. And then maybe that looks good preceding verse 18, but when you get into verse 18, the conversation that happens there that messes with our mind too. That just doesn't seem to work either. Again, we just got a lot of problems here. There's a lot that, again, you have to sort of imagine and infer. And I'm going to do that as we proceed. I'm going to basically say how I would approach this. But on the surface, this is not a simple section. You might think it's a simple section. You might think the only thing that really needs any thought here are verses 24 through 26, the bridegroom of blood weirdness. But that's not the case. There's a lot of things going on here that just don't, on the surface, make sense. When you start looking at it, and if you made a play of this, if you were going to reenact it, how in the world would you do it? You'd run into all sorts of problems. So, what do we do with this? Now, I'll throw one more in. When you get to verse 20, that has Moses taking his sons, plural, and Zipporah when he starts on the trip to Egypt. But Exodus 18, verse 2, notes that at some point Moses had sent Zipporah back home to Midian. I'll just read you Exodus 18:2. Now, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home. Again, when did he send her home? Does that have any relationship to verse 24, which is the beginning of the bridegroom of blood incident? Would that suggest that the bridegroom of blood incident occurs on the way to Egypt, and then on the way, Zipporah and at least one son are in the scene, but then, maybe they get sent back later? Do they ever actually get to Egypt? Again, we don't know. How in the world, are we going to explain all of that, then throw in the meeting with Aaron? Again, I'm trying to convey the sense that there's a lot that's confusing here. The chronology of events is really convoluted and problematic. It's hard to know if the parts of chapter 4 intend to give us any chronology or not. Again, it's another, critical scholars look at this kind of stuff and say, well, look, the reason this is a mess is because you have different sources. You have different source accounts that were stitched together by an editor. The whole JEDB thing, it's editing on steroids, okay? So, again, it's hard to know, how these parts of chapter 4 relate to each other. It's also impossible to know why Zipporah was sent back and precisely when. The text isn't really clear on any of those details. We have to imagine events or the purpose of the placement of verses 24 through 26 and go from there. Now, here's what I would propose. And I'm admitting up front that it springs from my imagination. I'm trying to take the data and just sort of, again, be like a movie director or something. If this was a play or we're going to reenact this, how would we account for all of the elements in something of a coherent fashion if we were visually seeing what's going on here? I tend to think Moses takes off from Sinai, right after the burning bush incident. And again, I mentioned that in the last episode. Whether God was happy with that or not, we can't necessarily know. Okay, again, I could see it going either way. I tend to think Moses takes off from Sinai. He could have waited, but he doesn't. He goes to Jethro's place, which is not Sinai. And he starts to have second thoughts, which would be entirely consistent with Moses' character. Okay. And so that's why God speaks to him again. I mean, God actually speaks to him again. Verse 19, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, they're in Midian, he's in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses might have been having second thought, like, man, if I go back to Egypt, they're going to kill me. See, that wasn't mentioned earlier. So he may be having second thoughts, and then God has to come with him and look, don't worry about it. I'll handle it. Those guys are dead. Get off your butt and go to Egypt. All right. So God speaks to him again while he's in Midian. And then Moses decides to tell Jethro he has to go to Egypt. And he does. Then he starts on the journey with Zipporah and the boys. The boys' names, of course, are Gershom and Eleazar. Their names are given later in Exodus 18, verses 2 through 4. On the way to Egypt, now here's a key element, and again, it's just springing from my imagination. I think this could have happened. On the way to Egypt, he passes by or near Sinai. Now, this is possible if Sinai is to the west of Midian, where Exodus 3:1 says it is. In other words, Moses has to journey around the north tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. He's got to go a little bit north and west, or maybe directly west, because we don't know where Jethro lived in Midian. We don't know what part of Midian. But in any way, Sinai, if it's west of Midian, would be on the way to going back to Egypt. So on the way to Egypt, Moses passes by, he stops at Sinai. Maybe he says, hey, we're going to Egypt, but first I have to meet Aaron at Sinai. And this is when the meeting, the episode of verses 27 through 31 occurs. God having called Aaron, tapped Aaron, weeks, months, we don't know, ago, because Aaron's in Egypt and he's got to make the trip too, the other direction. So it's at this point that Moses and Aaron meet, and they have the conversation they have in verses 27 through 31. And then together they head to Egypt. Now, God may not be happy. We could say that maybe, God thinks Moses should have stayed and waited for Aaron to, despite telling him this, Aaron was the solution, Moses loses heart, or the thought of the guys in Egypt trying to kill him surface in his mind. He has second thoughts. God has to speak to him again. All that's still up in the air, but at least we have a way to make sense of where Moses is and where he goes, his movements. He finally gets to Aaron at Sinai, okay, at the mountain of God, because you look at verse 27, the Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness and meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God. So they finally connect at Sinai, and then they go to Egypt. So that's how I would sort of reconstruct in my mind what's going on here to create a chronology out of this mess. To have it make sense, you have to infer some things. And I think that's legitimate. I mean, you got to do that in a lot of places, especially in narrative in the Old Testament. There's nothing that I just said that can't work with the text. I can't say that all of that is spelled out in the text, because it's not. If it was, we wouldn't even be having the discussion. But nothing I just gave you there violates any point of the text. And so this is what we're trying to do, just trying to make sense out of it. So now a question, a related question. Does the bridegroom of blood episode happen before or after they meet Aaron at Sinai? And if this is something of an intrusion and we're not told at all, I mean, it has some connection to the itinerary, because verse 24 says, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought him to put him to death. Okay. So this incident happens either before they meet up with Aaron or after. What is the way? Is it the way to Sinai that I've imagined, or the way to Egypt? Again, we're not told. So where does the Bridegroom of Blood episode happen? I would say it happens before they meet Aaron at Sinai. And I'm just going to say that my reasons for thinking that will become evident as we proceed here. I'm just going to telegraph it up front, so it's lurking, in the back of your mind here. I think that the Bridegroom of Blood episode happens before they meet up with Aaron at Sinai, and then from Sinai they go to Egypt. The only thing that might throw this off is verse 27's wording. The Lord said to Moses. Now Moses should have already known what the Lord said about going to meet Aaron. He should have already known that. I mean, God has mentioned it before, but maybe the point is that, hey, Moses, God's speaking to Moses, hey, we're good now. Okay, I'm not angry. I'm not going to kill you. Zipporah has taken care of the problem that was prompting me to think about killing you. So keep going to Sinai, hook up with Aaron, and then get to Egypt. Again, I still have to infer that. In other words, God says, we're good now and the plan is still on. Now, having said all that, I really don't think that the Bridegroom of Blood incident, verses 24 through 26, is actually about Moses' continued second guessing or faint-heartedness. I think it's about another problem with Moses. And I think that for a simple reason. Whatever the problem is, it's taken care of by a circumcision. That would really have nothing to do with Moses leaving Sinai or needing a pep talk from God. A circumcision doesn't fix those things. There's something going on in verses 24 through 26 that is an altogether different problem involving Moses. And that problem is taken care of by Zipporah's quick action in circumcising, performing the circumcision. Now let's look at verses 24 through 26 for the rest of our episode. Zero in on the Bridegroom of Blood stuff. I'm going to read the verses again. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. Okay. Cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. Now, I have, back in 2011, so this is 7 years ago, I had blogged about this. I had mentioned that in the last time. What I'm going to give you here, again, I think is just worded better than what was back on the blog. So I've actually swapped some of this discussion in. I more or less wanted to write this out for the sake of the blog, because there were some things in there that I thought were just not clear, not sufficiently clear. So I've tried to dress that up a little bit. So I'm telling you that here on the podcast. But, what we're going to hear now, again, is essentially, you could have read it before already, on the blog. But I think the wording is better here. I just took a little more time to, for the sake of clarity, to try to dress things up. The issues are, again, as we look at verses 24 through 26, what are the things we need to think about? Well, there's what in the world is up with placing the foreskin at Moses' feet. It's kind of odd that God would want to kill Moses, especially on the heels of calling him and then making a concession for him with the Aaronic priesthood, and then reminding him that you need to go to Egypt while he's in Midian. Again, it would have to be something that's pretty significant, for Moses as the person God wants to lead his people, for God to just get this angry and consider killing him. The other issue is that, as we're going to see, there are certain ambiguities in these three verses in the text, specifically what certain verbs refer to and who the actors are precisely in the scene. Because I can tell you right now, the ESV has made, and every translation does this isn't a slap on the ESV. The ESV translator has inserted names and nouns in places in verses 24 through 26 where in the Hebrew text there are only pronouns, he and his and him. Okay, the translator has done that to try to make the content of these verses comprehensible. But we need to talk about that because knowing that certain things are ambiguous in the Hebrew text, like what does the pronoun refer to when it says his or him? Is it Moses' son or Moses? Again, which they're both masculine. So which one does the masculine pronoun refer to? You have to make an educated or an interpretive guess. You have to land somewhere in interpretation, and the translation, of course, is going to land somewhere to try to steer us through. But sometimes the choices that translators make are good. Sometimes they're not so good. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they muddy the waters even more. But we need to think about all of these things. So let's try to approach the stuff we need to think about. Really, I guess, two trajectories here. So first, who is it that the Lord wanted to kill? Now you would think, and we've sort of presumed here in the sake of our discussion, you would think that that's Moses. And most readers would assume it is Moses since he's mentioned in the preceding verses. But verse 24 actually doesn't name him. We see here, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. We don't get the Lord met Moses. We get the Lord met him. And you say, well, why is that an issue? Well, Moses is traveling with two boys, his two sons. Could it be that Moses or God wanted to put one of them to death? Would that make more sense? Because he just called Moses. Why does he want to kill him off now? I mean, you actually have this discussion going on. And since it's one of the boys' foreskins that is removed through circumcision, in other words, since the solution of the episode is the circumcision of one of the boys, maybe it's one of the boys that God wants to kill because he's uncircumcised. Okay? So, who exactly are we talking about? Who's under threat? The other, again, trajectory is, what does it mean for Zipporah to touch Moses' feet with the foreskin? Now, there are two other factors, again, that are going to be part of this discussion as we try to take things in order. Again, Zipporah knows what to do. She's familiar with circumcision, obviously. She knows that it should be done, and she knows how to do it. She knows how it's done. So that is going to become a factor in interpretation as well. So we've got ambiguities in there. We've got some things we can assume about Zipporah, who is a Midianite woman. Again, and think of the Kenites. The Kenites should be familiar with the worship of Yahweh. And part of the worship of Yahweh, whether they're the quote unquote, forgotten or lesser line, the non-elect line from Abraham, they still know about circumcision. Okay, so there's something going on there. Zipporah knows it's important. She knows what to do. She knows how to solve the problem. She knows what the problem is, and she takes care of business. And the way she takes care of business is circumcising her son. So we've got that much. Is the son the one under the threat? What about this touch in the feet thing? Again, that's what we've, as we proceed, those are the questions we need to answer. So let's take things in order. With whom was God angry and why? Now, I would say it seems best to conclude that God is angry with Moses and not his son Gershom. Since Moses is the major character in the wider context, and Gershom is known only from Exodus 2:22 at this point, he has nothing to do with the story. And so despite the fact that it's the circumcision of the child that fixes the problem, or is it? Okay, or is it? Is God's anger pacified just by circumcising the boy, or is more needed? Yeah, we'll get back to that point. But if there's more needed, then it's not. We can't necessarily conclude that just because the boy is circumcised that he's the problem. So I think that Moses is the one under threat here. That just makes more sense. Scholars have noted that Moses is the center of Yahweh's attention everywhere else in the story, even in the digressions about Aaron. It's still really about Moses and how to deal with his resistance, his unbelief, his uncertainty, his really in some, I think you could call it rebellion in some sense as well. So that much seems clear. I mean, it's a better option. But of course, that the question of why God is angry with him is still on the table. So I would say the answer to that question has to be inferred from two considerations. One, the Israelites born in Egypt had been circumcised. Okay, although this might still be a problem. They were circumcised, according to what God had passed on or told Abraham to do. We know from Joshua 5, verses 2 through 9. I'm just going to read you that section because it's going to become relevant here. We read again, this is Joshua. This is about, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. So it's much later. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. A second? How can you be circumcised a second time? That's interesting, isn't it? So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeat ha-Aralot. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. Okay, so you've got kids, growing up, and apparently you could say, well, okay, they weren't circumcised yet. Why the second time? Verse 5, though all the people who came out of Egypt, okay, so verse 4 is about the kids that were born during the wilderness wanderings and all that. They need to be circumcised, okay, the boys, the men. But verse 5 harkens back to the previous generation. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So verse 5, the first part of it says, the people who came out, had come out of Egypt, they had been circumcised. So they're doing circumcision in Egypt, okay, or, before this point. It's the ones afterwards that have not. But then what in the world is this second time thing going on? It's just really odd. Verse 7, so it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. So verse 8, they circumcised the whole nation. When that was finished, they remained in their places in the camp till they were healed. And then, of course, the conquest is going to start. So, what's up with this? How does it inform the issue with Moses? Why is God angry at him? And again, this has to be inferred from two considerations. The Israelites born in Egypt had been circumcised, apparently according to, the covenant with Abraham. That's why they were doing it. And two, we have to consider the circumstances of Moses' birth and childhood again. Now, let's just jump in. With respect to the first of these items, it may be that the Israelites in Egypt practiced Egyptian circumcision. Okay, Israelites are in Egypt. What we just read in Joshua says they were circumcising down in Egypt. Maybe this Joshua doing the circumcision a second time, maybe this refers to the fact that, or to the possibility that, the circumcision they were doing in Egypt was not correct. Egyptian circumcision, which by the way refers to a method, not anything religious, like circumcision wasn't being done in honor to some foreign god, okay? Egyptian circumcision refers to a method, and it's possible Moses and other Israelite men were not properly circumcised. The second time in Joshua 5:2 might be an indication of this, that, yep, they were, but we got to do it again because it wasn't done right. Having fled from Egypt, God may have expected Moses to correct this before returning to Egypt. Because Moses is the representative now of Israel. He is the leader of Israel, whether he wants to be or not, he is. Aaron's going to again take up the slack, obviously. But Moses is the key figure here, and God might be angry with him because he has been circumcised incorrectly and never took care of the problem. Now, that's an argument from silence, but any other explanation is as well. So this is what we're dealing with here. Let me just rabbit trail a little bit about the circumcision thing in Egypt. Archaeologists and Egyptologists know that circumcision was practiced in Egypt by the Egyptians. However, Egyptian circumcision did not remove the foreskin. That's how it's possible you could be circumcised again, all right, if it wasn't done properly. Egyptian circumcision did not remove the foreskin. Rather, the foreskin was just split. It was left there, but it was split. For this reason, any Israelite born in Egypt who happened to be circumcised in this way had not been circumcised in a manner acceptable to God's covenant. Those who take this trajectory as an explanation for God's anger would suggest that Egyptian circumcision is what's hinted at in Joshua 5:2, again about the second time, but also Joshua 5:9, which reads, "And the Lord said to Joshua, Today I have rolled away the reproach from Egypt from you." The reproach from Egypt might be they're bonded in slavery because they're going to go into the land now and have their own land. I get that. But there are some who say that the issue with circumcising them the second time is correcting this Egyptian method. And maybe that is the reproach of Egypt. We're fixing that problem now by having everybody, both the men who came out of Egypt that are still around, and then the second generation that was born on the way in the wilderness wanderings. They're both circumcised properly now, both groups. So maybe that's what the reproach of Egypt refers to. Again, it's possible. So again, given this set of circumstances, the ceremony in Joshua 5 would be a second circumcision for some and a first circumcision for the males born in the wilderness wanderings. And Joshua 5:2 is really what this view hangs on, this reference to the second time. So that's one way to look at this. Since other Israelite males were circumcised prior to the conquest, again prior to Joshua 5:2-9 at Gilgal, and some a second time, it is reasonable to assume, again, since they had to do this, since they had to fix this, first generation and second generation, it's reasonable to assume that Moses had never been circumcised, or that he was circumcised according to Egyptian custom. The narrative of Moses' birth and childhood never states that his parents, like his Israelite parents, had him circumcised. Had the boy been marked by Hebrew circumcision, maybe his life would have been in danger in Pharaoh's household. Who knows? We can only speculate whether Pharaoh's daughter had him circumcised in the Egyptian manner after he entered her household. In either scenario, whether Pharaoh's daughter had this done according to the Egyptian custom, or whether his Israelite parents just didn't do it, again, thinking that, well, when the baby's discovered, if they see it's an Israelite male, they might kill him because that's what Pharaoh ordered. Okay, either scenario means that Moses did not bear the covenant sign, and that is why God is angry. Now, in his Exodus commentary, this is in the Word Biblical Commentary series, Durham notes this material. This is his discussion over all this. So it's not just Mike here, okay? Durham is going to he's going to cite an article by Jack Sasson. It's Sasson. So here we go. The quote is this: Sasson has pointed out convincingly that Egyptian circumcision was not only performed on adults, but was, by comparison with Hebrew circumcision, merely a partial circumcision. Indeed, he contends that circumcision may well have come to Egypt from North Syria, where it was practiced early in the 3rd millennium BC. For whatever reasons, the compiler, who set verses 24 through 26 in their present context, had apparently reached a conclusion confirmed by these facts. Perhaps he combined the abnormal circumstances by which the infant Moses had been hidden away at birth with some knowledge of the Egyptian practice and even a belief that the circumcision of infant boys was a late development in Israel's life. Quite possibly, he too was searching for some reason for Yahweh's serious encounter. Whatever the case, he clearly believed that Moses was uncircumcised and that Yahweh determined to stop him en route to Egypt for that reason. That's the end of the Durham quote. So again, this isn't Mike just sort of speculating. I mean, this is an explanation for why God is angry that other scholars, have come up with, and again, just trying to overview the basis for it. Another angle, again with this, let's just go back to Moses' childhood here. Another angle is that it's possible Moses' mother would not have had him circumcised again because of the edict. I want to say a little bit more about that. Again, the rationale in that case would have been that, maybe an Egyptian who discovers the boy will see him uncircumcised and have mercy on him or something like that. But see, there's a problem with that. Pharaoh's daughter knew immediately that the baby was a Hebrew. So the question is, how did she know? Now, it doesn't have to be because he was circumcised. It could be something as simple as, well, why would anybody else put their kid in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile? It's got to be a Hebrew kid. In the movie, it has him with a Hebrew blanket or something. Just Ten Commandments movie doesn't get into all this stuff. So it doesn't have to. The fact that Pharaoh's daughter recognizes this is a Hebrew boy doesn't mean that the Hebrew boy was circumcised. He may not have been. Even if he was, again, there's no sense in avoiding the circumcision. You would think, because she's trusting God or whatever. I think the chances are really good. I think that if the Israelite parents of Moses had him circumcised, then there's no need for the secondary Egyptian circumcision, which again did not remove the foreskin. So I think the best bet here is, again, it's all a guess. This is all speculation. I think the best bet is that Moses arrived in Pharaoh's household uncircumcised. Pharaoh's daughter had him circumcised according to the Egyptian custom, which was a partial circumcision, and that was never corrected when Moses fled Egypt and went into Midian. And he's not thinking about Yahweh at all. He's thinking about, I got to get out of Egypt and basically stay alive and have a nice home here. But God calls him at the burning bush incident. And again, we're not told, they don't have a conversation about circumcision, but it apparently God is thinking, do the math, Moses. You're in Midian. They worship Yahweh here. I'm Yahweh. I'm calling you to go to Egypt. You might want to bear the sign of the covenant people if you're leading the covenant people. But apparently that either that doesn't occur to Moses, or he said, I don't. Well, that's going to hurt. Because entirely consistent with Moses' character here. That's going to hurt. And I don't want to go anyway. And so he goes back to Midian. He doesn't talk to Jethro right away. God has to remind him, you're supposed to go to Egypt. Okay, and God even, look, everybody who wanted you dead is dead now. Let's get the show on the road here. And Moses does. He moves. They go on their way. They stop at Sinai. They meet. They're going to do all that. But when he leaves Midian, and this is my view, when he leaves Midian, he's on the way to Sinai. This is before they've met Aaron. God gets angry because he has not taken care of the covenant sign of proper circumcision. Again, this is how I would reconstruct things here. I think this is probably the best sort of scenario that we can garner and put together. Again, using some inference, using our imagination a little bit to infer some things about why God would have been angry and how the itinerary works. Now, the reason why I think this event happens before they meet Aaron is because Aaron is a priest. He's a Levite. He would know what to do. I mean, if it became clear that God's going to kill Moses unless we do the circumcision thing or whatever, he would know what to do. And so Zipporah would not have to perform the circumcision of her boy. Aaron would have done that. Again, this is all guesswork. It's an argument from silence. But I think, again, you can put the things together by making those inferences. So again, this is my view of how things are going on. What the scenario is. Now you could ask, well, why didn't she just circumcise her husband Moses, and then they, wait a few weeks or whatever? Moses is probably a crybaby about that, like he's a crybaby about everything. So it might take a week or two or whatever, or maybe Moses would use it as an excuse to delay the trip even further. And I think that's the key. I think the reason why it was sufficient for Zipporah to circumcise the child and then touch Moses' feet, and we'll get to what feet are, with the foreskin of her son, sort of a circumcision by proxy. I think that's probably what's going on, that it's a symbolic gesture or something like that to have God's anger against Moses pacified. So let's just jump into the rest of it. So I think that is what's actually going on, and I think because she does it, they're not in Aaron's presence yet. Again, I'm fully admitting that I'm just using inferences here, and again trying to piece together things from the data that aren't specifically said, but everybody has to do that. So we're at the point of asking the question, who was circumcised and what did it mean? Now, regardless of the fact that we don't know how to precisely take all this stuff because it's never spelled out, you got a couple options here. Either Moses was properly circumcised and he neglected to have his son circumcised. in which case God could be, in theory, mad at either one of them. But if that's the case, when they circumcise the kid, why doesn't it end there? Why doesn't it stop there? Why do you have to touch Moses' quote unquote feet to make things good with God? So again, I think the real problem is Moses. Again, that his inadequate circumcision. And it's not just the boy. And I think that they don't circumcise Moses there because that's going to delay the trip even longer. And God wants him in Egypt. I mean, the one thing you do that does come through clearly if you read chapter 4 is God wants him in Egypt, like now. You know, we're not going to put this off anymore. I've told Aaron to meet you. Let's go. Go, 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 go. Okay, get out of here. So I think that, again, is part of the rationale. Now, the Midianites, again, as you think back to the Kenite episode, as worshipers of Yahweh, they're going to know about circumcision. They're going to know about Abraham. They're going to know about the covenant. They know about the necessary tool, the flint, knife there to do the right. Again, they know what's going on here. So this is how I would handle what the rest of our little weird, sidebar here, verses 24 through 26. Again, concerning whether Moses or his son Gershom was circumcised, clarity can be gained in Zipporah's act of touching the foreskin to the feet of Moses. And I think Moses is the issue. Let's talk about the feet before moving on. The Hebrew word for feet, regel, can refer to feet, legs, or genitals, according to Old Testament usage. This was a euphemism. It was a word that was used, again, as sort of a nice way, to refer to the genital area. Every language, every culture, has this sort of thing. Euphemistic language for private parts or sexual acts or something like that. Okay, this is what we're dealing with. For example, in Deuteronomy 28:57, we read, her afterbirth, this is again part of law, her afterbirth that comes out from between her feet and her children whom she bears, so on and so forth. Well, the afterbirth doesn't really come out between your feet. I mean, the legs are apart. And, I was there at the birth of my kid, and the afterbirth, the feet were there too. Look, the whole point is that the afterbirth comes out of the genital area, okay, of a woman. Go to Ezekiel 16:25. I think it's even clearer. This is really the somewhat pornographic passage that we covered back in our series on Ezekiel, where the language is really graphic. Sexual language is really graphic there. And we have this verse I'm going to just go out to this one and pick up a little bit, maybe the verse before. I'll start in verse 23. So Judah is being compared to a whore, okay, a prostitute, prostituting herself with other nations, other gods, committing spiritual adultery, all this kind of stuff. Adultery and sexual whoredom were used as metaphors for spiritual unfaithfulness. So we read in verse 23, after all your wickedness, woe, woe to you, declares the Lord God. You built yourself a vaulted chamber, built yourself a bedroom there, set up a bed, and made yourself a lofty place in every square. You're looking for clients at every street corner. At the head of every street, you built your lofty place and made your beauty an abomination, offering yourself to any passerby and multiplying your whoredom, or your whoring. Now, ESV's offering yourself is literally in the Hebrew spreading your regel, spreading your feet. Again, it's exposing your genitals, spreading your legs. Okay, I mean that we get the idea. You're not, the woman in Ezekiel 16 who does this doesn't want some man to come by and touch her feet, like her real feet with toes, okay? That's not what's going on there. This is euphemistic language, again, for the sexual, genital area. You get the same thing with Ruth 3 and 4. Again, Naomi tells Ruth, when Boaz lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, he will tell you what to do. This is when Ruth wants to, and she gets the message across pretty well. She uncovers his genital area. I mean, they're wearing these long skirt things. She just flips it open. They don't have underwear, folks, in the Bible days, okay? That'll probably become a meme now. They don't have underwear. So she exposes him. Why does she expose him? Why does Ruth do this to Boaz? It's a marriage proposal. I want you to marry me. I want to have your children. You need to redeem me. We're related. It's the law of the kinsman redeemer. She wants him to take her in, and become his wife. And then we get the whole thing about, well, there's somebody that's in line ahead of me, and got to take care of that kinsman thing according to the laws of Deuteronomy, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's nothing sexual, as far as intercourse that happens in the Ruth scene, because that would have been a violation of the kinsman law. And Boaz doesn't do that. They go through the legal procedure before he can marry her. But she makes her intent, her wish, very obvious. She exposes him and then lays down. And it's like, okay, message understood. Because they have the conversation about what to do next. But again, the whole point is here, the reference to the feet is the genital area. Now, Durham, again, notes this. This isn't just Mike, going to crazy town here. This is common, Old Testament scholarship. This is nothing new. You'd find this in serious commentaries written by various people. Again, Durham thinks this makes good, again, contextual sense as far as Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, when, put it this way, the act of touching the foreskin of Moses' son. Okay, Zipporah performs the circumcision, takes the foreskin, and touches Moses' feet. The act of touching the foreskin to the feet, i.e. Moses' own genital area, the touching part is not part of normal circumcision. You don't read that as part of a procedure for circumcision, so there's some special circumstance. And of course, the circumstance is that Moses' own circumcision is not adequate. He has to be approved. He has to be sort of looped into the covenant relationship by proxy. He has to have this taken care of, like now, and then get to Egypt, like now. So it consequently only makes sense if Zipporah has circumcised her son, Gershom, and then symbolically transferred the circumcision to Moses by taking the foreskin and touching Moses' genitals with it. Under the circumstances, Moses would have been incapacitated had they done this to him, had they circumcised him, and they were already on the way to Egypt. So apparently, if you read again through verse 26, God was satisfied by the ritual act, and Zipporah had saved her husband's life. I mean, that's what's going on here. In regard to the phrase bridegroom of blood, the phrase is obviously associated with the marital relationship. Okay, the word bridegroom there. So why use the term, and what's the bridegroom of blood? I mean, what's the significance of the phrase? Moses' status as a bridegroom must, of course, have some importance here. And Durham, I'll just read from Durham here. Durham says, Zipporah, the only person available to perform the rite, and again, I agree with that because I don't think they've met Aaron yet, seizes the mandatory flint cutting tool and circumcises not Moses, who would have been temporarily incapacitated by the surgery, at a crucial time when he could no longer delay his journey. So she circumcises her son. For the child, who was not to make the journey to Egypt in any case, the effects of the circumcision would be less problematic. To transfer the effect of the rite, Zipporah touched the severed foreskin of her son to the genitals of Moses, intoning as she did so the ancient formula, recalling circumcision as a premarital rite. For a bridegroom of blood you are to me. This ancient phrase, as Mitchell has demonstrated, it was a phrase of marital relationship. Now, in other words, let me try to decipher some of that. Circumcision was a premarital ritual, obviously performed on a male infant, well before the boy is going to get married. As the sign of the covenant, circumcision identified men as Israelite for the sake of Israelite women, because they were only supposed to marry fellow Israelites. So when you got your man there, it's your honeymoon night, okay, the fact that he's circumcised is important because then you're marrying within the covenant bounds. This is why circumcision is, one of its meanings is, again, has to do with marriage, that the marriage is legit, okay, it's within, again, the Israelite community. So it ensured that the married couple were both Israelites and there was no forbidden intermarriage taking place. We have to assume that Zipporah had learned and embraced the idea that the God of the mountain she knew by virtue of her proximity to it in Midian anyway. They had heard of Yahweh and they knew where the mountain was. It's not next door, but they know where it is. That this was the God of the Israelites, okay, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he was the true God. So Zipporah apparently knows that, believes it. This is particularly coherent if the Kenite connection involves the worship of Yahweh, which again we talked about at length. Zipporah's marriage to Moses linked her to the Israelite people. Okay, she's marrying Moses now, and their covenant relationship to Yahweh. Under normal circumstances, her husband would have been a circumcised Israelite man, but that apparently isn't what's going on here between the two of them. This ritual of circumcision by proxy made Moses her bridegroom of blood. It legitimized him as an Israelite man that she could marry and be secure in marrying within a covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so part of the ritual act of touching the foreskin of Gershom to Moses' genital area atoned for this oversight. And again, Zipporah saves Moses. And here's the kicker, we'll end with this, a little bit of a kicker here. Zipporah saves his life. How? By performing a priestly act. That's interesting in and of itself because she's a woman, right? A woman plays the role of a priest in this scene, and God accepts that. And the circumstances are unusual, but there it is. And this is why I think the incident occurred again before Moses linked up with Aaron. Had Aaron been there, he's a Levite, he likely would have done this, and there you go. Now, without getting into the whole, women in ministry issue, which if you're unfamiliar with me or my podcast or the blog, I don't know how many years ago it was, probably 5-6 years ago as well. I went through a blog series with my friend John Hobbins, who is we met in the doctoral program at Wisconsin. John is a Methodist pastor, and his wife is also a pastor at the same church. So John proposed to me one day, hey, let's you and I blog back and forth about the women in ministry issue. And I said to him, and we put it in the blog series. I said, okay, your mission here is to make me care. And the reason I said that is because I can argue both sides of this really well, and that alone tells me that, again, if you can argue both sides really well, and ultimately you get down to things like the non-use of accents in capital uncial script in Greek manuscripts. I'm not kidding. It gets that granular, to decide, this whole issue. So to me, this is something that, look, you'd have to be omniscient to know for sure where to land on this. And so to me, this is a conscience issue, which is why I said, just make me care. Whatever decision you make it before the Lord, and, whatever it is, do a good job. Or not. I mean, this is how I would approach it with my own daughter. If I had a daughter that said, I feel called to the ministry, this is exactly what I would tell her. I don't know that this is, the right decision, but I'm not going to get in your way. It's between you and the Lord, and in the providence of God, if this is what the Lord wants you to do, good, and do a good job. Don't screw up. That kind of thing. So beyond that, it's such a difficult issue. It's so granular. Anybody who tells you that there's nothing to see here and argue about is just wrong. They're just wrong. What things that you think are clear, like 1 Timothy 3, husband and one wife thing, trust me. You take that over the same description to deacons, and guess what? You got a female deacon in 1 Corinthians. Now what do you do with that? Well, that must have been the deacon's wife. Oh, really? Where does it say that? Well, it doesn't, but that's what I think, because I need to think that, because this is the view I want to defend. Exactly. So this is where this debate goes. It goes to, again, picking the things that you want to accentuate to defend your view. And I think the best thing to do here is just be honest and say, look, I can argue both sides of this really well. It's amazingly granular at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, we have to guess. And so I'm not going to disfellowship you on the basis of my guessing, even if I think the guessing is good. I'm just not going to do that. Like I like to say, I will let some other ministry fight Christians. I'm not going to do that. Let's circle it back here. I think it's interesting, though. You can't use Exodus 4:24 through 26 to say egalitarianism, that is, women can be ordained. Okay, egalitarianism is biblical. Look at what Zipporah did. Okay, that's an overuse of the data. The circumstances are really unusual. But on the other side, the complementarian side, which says women cannot be ordained, okay, they should not be in ministry, that side routinely neglects things like this. Okay, where God himself is good with a woman performing a priestly function. It's just there in the text. Now, it doesn't mean that their view is overturned either. You have to be able to say this is a proof of one thing to overturn the other. It becomes a little piece, a little cog, a little, just one of many items in this whole discussion, the women in ministry discussion. So, I mean, you could go look at the website. Hobbins is spelled Hobbins. You'll find it if you put drmsh.com and Hobbins and women in ministry or something like that in there. You're going to find our little back and forth. It was fun. I think it was entertaining and useful for some people. But to me, there's built-in ambiguity to the whole issue. It's very difficult. So I think extreme forms of complementarianism ought to at least take note of what's going on here in Exodus 4:24 through 26. Zipporah does what she does. It's a priestly role, and God is good with it. But that's about all you can say. You can't really build a view on that or overturn somebody else's view. We have to be honest with the limitations of the data, and just be good with that. So again, I'll let some other ministry beat up Christians on either side, from either side or against either. I'll let them do that, but I'm just not going to do that. There's just more interesting and better things to do with my time, and I think there's better things for you to do with your time than, again, try to take something that's ambiguous and pretend at the end of the day that it's not, because it is. Be warmed and filled. Pick the view that you prefer, but be honest with the other side and say, I'm here because I prefer this for this, that, and the other reason, but you are still a brother. I am not going to look at you as any lesser because you don't take this particular issue the way I do. Okay, this is the way I approach prophecy. I mean, just any number of things. These things are what they are. I think we should study them. We should try to think well about them. But more important than that, is we should treat each other like not only fellow imagers, but brethren, brothers and sisters in the Lord, even when we come to disagree over things. So again, that was just a little bit of a sidebar. But I think, again, the passage is interesting just as a contributing point to that bigger theological discussion. So we're at the end of Exodus 4 here, and that means next time we will jump into chapter 5.
All right, Mike. Well, we'll take your educated guess over most, so it works for us.
That's what it is. It is.
We'll take it. And again, my whole deal is it's okay to not know. You don't have to know every single little thing, and that's okay.
I don't know. This is going to be an illustration totally lost on most people, but here's what it makes me think of. If you're listening out there and you've ever seen the movie In Search of Bobby Fischer, there's a scene in there where the guy is taking his son, who's this chess prodigy, to a chess club, to eventually, I guess, make him a grandmaster or something like this. And there's this scene where there's this this guy comes up to the instructor. He interrupts a conversation between the instructor and the kid, and he's like trembling with excitement. I captured a pawn. And that was it. It's like it took him weeks, against these fellow, players who are just at this elevated level. Like he got a pawn. Okay. That's what this reminds me of. These sorts of discussions where they're they're difficult. And to think that you've accomplished something, by capturing the pawn, you really haven't. There's a whole lot more to the game, than just this one pawn. So I always think about that kind of obsession, that obsessiveness. That you're so dedicated, you've got to find the answer to this thing. The authorship of the book of Hebrews. That's kind of an academic joke now for people who sort of lose their minds and maybe their careers. They get obsessed with these questions like who wrote the book of Hebrews. And at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but you just can't know. There's no way to know for sure. So take all that energy and that skill and that training and put it into maybe things that you can know better, or ministry. You just let it go. Let it be what it is.
I love chess references. My son, last year, he was 8, and we entered a chess tournament for the first time ever, and he beat a local high school chess member in 4 moves. So that was a very proud moment for me.
There you go.
I taught him chess. I love chess, so I taught him to play since he was 5. And I mean, he's not, a grandmaster, don't get me wrong, but hey, to beat a high school kid as an 8-year-old in your first tournament in 4 moves, it was a very proud father moment for me. So I'll take it.
And I'm sure that did something for his self-esteem too.
Yeah, it was awesome. Bobby Fischer, love those references. There you go.